Welcome to the Red Light Exposé podcast.
We are an international grassroots survivor-led circle.
Our goal is to counter the growing acceptance of sex work ideology.
We aim to raise awareness of the harms of commercializing sex,
meaning prostitution, porn, stripping, and BDSM.
Through honest, in-depth conversations,
we elevate voices often ignored and silenced.
Together, we're challenging stereotypes and dismantling myths.
We envision a healthier, safer society, especially for women and girls.
We appreciate your company on this journey. Hello and welcome back to the Red Light Exposé podcast. My name is Ellie Arrow. I'm an activist against sexual exploitation in Germany. And today we're discussing the intersection of prostitution, trafficking, and domestic violence. And with me today is Michelle Kelly. Michelle is a best-selling author and ghostwriter from the UK who went public about her experiences being trafficked in 2019. Eyes Wide Open, published in 2015 by HarperCollins, is a heavily fictionalized attempt to process some of these experiences. Hi, Michelle. Thank you for being with us today.
Hi, Ellie. Thank you for having me on.
So we've chosen a big, heavy topic for today. There's going to be a lot to get into. I was just thinking about it today, like what's the public image of the subject? And I remembered over here in Germany, our discussion around this is very focused on the lover boy phenomenon.
Okay.
Is that what you call it in the UK as well, lover boy?
Not really, no. I haven't really seen that in the media over here. I think we talk about the same thing, the same phenomenon, but we don't tend to use that term so much.
Okay, interesting. I think it's also called a Romeo pimp. And it's become a big issue here where there's lots of organizations like putting out pamphlets or going into schools warning usually, teenage girls that there is usually young men who will even loiter outside schools or places where teenagers hang out and talk to them and you chat them up, start a relationship, take them to parties. And then when the young person, who's often has multiple vulnerabilities, becomes emotionally dependent, then they will become their pimp. And it starts with, would you want to do it with my friend? Or I have money troubles, those sorts of situation. I think it's important that awareness is happening.
Oh, absolutely.
But it is neither new nor is it just about teenagers. It can happen to a woman at any age. The perpetrator can be any age. So I wanted to ask you, can you take us to the start of your story relating to this? The first time that you were trafficked was actually escaping a domestic violence situation, right? That so many women end up in trafficking or prostitution because they're running from something worse or seemingly worse. Can you take us through that?
Absolutely. So, as you said, I had two different experiences with two different perpetrators. And the first time I was around 19, 20 years, and I was very much running away from a domestically violent relationship, from a perpetrator of domestic abuse. And I had zero support from kind of family or anything. I was very much homeless. And because I'd been relying on him financially, had no sort of means or resources. And what was provided by the local council where I lived was incredibly meagre. At that time, there was no spaces in the local refuges. I'm going back to, this would have been 2002, 2003. I'm 44 now. And so a girl who I'd known for a few months took me under her wing, and I guess she was what would be called a recruiter. She introduced me to her boyfriend. This guy was literally advertising in the back of the newspaper. Although trafficking is supposed to be illegal here, as long as you're careful how you word it, escort agencies are actually perfectly legal. It's just a case of not making it obvious that it's sex for money so that you just frame it as dating for money. And so that's how it was sold to me, is you just go out on a few dates with these men. You don't have to do anything else if you don't want to. And of course, it will be easy money. And I was very much in quite a desperate situation. So she took me to meet this boyfriend of hers. And essentially, I was raped and then taken straight to the first buyer. And obviously, I was expected to sleep with them. There was no date. I was bundled into a hotel room and then picked up afterwards by which point, as you can imagine, I was obviously terrified.
Yes.
And I was staying on this girl's settee as well at the time. This carried on for a few months with me being terrified as to how I was going to get away. I managed to go and stay with my nan at some point in the middle of this, but because they knew where I was and I was then terrified, bringing their attention onto my family. So I was still going to this job, which obviously, as I say, wasn't any kind of job, but I was still turning up because I was scared of what would happen if I didn't. And it took me a long time afterwards to really understand what had happened to me. I still very much blamed myself. I went to meet the boyfriend. I took myself there later on from my nan's house to where I was supposed to meet the driver. Although I clearly knew I'd been raped, but I still very much blame myself for having been involved with the prostitution side of it. I would never have applied the term trafficking at that point. And in the end, after a few months of this, the only way I could foresee that I was going to get out of this situation was to go back to my ex-partner. I just didn't see any other way out of it where I would have some protection, if that makes sense, from the traffickers, because my ex-partner was also involved in criminal activity and things. So I literally was just bouncing from one abuser to another in an attempt to keep myself safe. And as I say, it took me a long time after that to process that experience. And I assumed for a long time that I was on my own, and I felt so much shame around it. And it was only really when I started opening up and speaking to other women, I realised that actually my story isn't that uncommon.
Yeah.
And certainly in terms of recruiting, of how traffickers recruit and also will use their victims, women, to recruit, this pattern of going for women who are clearly already vulnerable, whether that's homeless, escaping domestic violence, whether it's young girls in the foster care system, obviously they are the people that they're zeroing in on. They're going for people who are clearly desperate and in situations where they have no support and no one to look out for them. So actually what happened to me wasn't that unusual at all.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've heard similar stories from many women. Trying to get out from one pimp means finding someone else who's more feared, and that's going from the frying pan into the fire.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because there are support services, but they're so patchy. There's some place you can sleep a couple of nights. There's some place who might give you some secondhand clothing and a bit of food and some tampons, but actually sitting down with someone, first of all, letting them breathe after escaping something, and then slowly making a plan. What are the next steps? How do we get you reliable housing, stable income, whatever childcare, medical care is needed? That's so rare and so desperately underfunded. And when you did, in that time, the services that you were able to access, was there any awareness there? Did they have any idea what was going on? Was there awareness of how vulnerable to trafficking and exploitation women in that situation are?
It was never mentioned. Even when I went to the housing for the homelessness issue and tried to explain that I was escaping domestic violence, it felt very sort of hand waved away. I didn't feel believed particularly. And so there was no way I was then going to tell them of the situation that I was in. As I say, I very much felt that I'd got myself into that situation. Things I've heard from women over the past few years who have tried to open up, there is still that stigma of, oh, well, you're a prostitute then. And there aren't those questions asked around coercion and trafficking. There seems to be just a complete lack of awareness. I think we still, and this was certainly true for me until I became more knowledgeable, there's still the assumption that trafficking is something that happens across international borders and is very much still seen as the kind of gun to the head, chain to the wall, the kind of thing that you see in a Liam Neeson movie. And domestic sex trafficking, I think, is rarely spoken about unless it's, as you say, the sort of the lover boy phenomenon, which we don't really call it that here, but we've recently had a spate of scandals with the grooming gangs. I think you've probably seen where sort of gangs of men will traffic teenage girls, quite often minors. So there's been a lot of focus on that in the news, but unfortunately that focus has become wrapped up in very sort of racist rhetoric, because some of the grooming gangs that have been prosecuted have been largely made up of British Pakistani men. And so that the sort of racist angle has overshadowed the actual conversation around domestic sex trafficking, as if it only ever happens in this community, which of course isn't true.
And even with that one, I was reading just horrific descriptions of social services blaming those girls. I think some of the girls were like 12, 13. I don't believe in blaming a person of any age, but even very obvious, very young minors being blamed as easy and slags and why do they keep going back? And we're just very slowly coming to an understanding, at least in sections of the population, why women go back to domestic abusers. But this is no different, like going back to a pimp, especially if there's this emotional manipulation going on. Can you elaborate on how these invisible chains that are harder to prove in court, it can be threats, it can be, like I said, like some men are like, oh, baby, I have debts, I need your help. That sort of faux vulnerable abuser. Can you talk about those more invisible chains? They're not a gun to the head, not chained to the radiator, but they're still extremely coercive and hard to get out of.
Well, it's probably a good time to talk about what happened next, really. So there was a fair few years between that first experience and the second. And although to some degree I managed to scrape a life together, the trauma of that slowly started to come out in other ways. I ended up in another violent relationship. And after some time in that relationship, he trafficked me, beginning with webcamming and then into the porn industry more broadly. And these things don't happen overnight. As you say, people will say things like, why do you do it? Why don't you leave? I don't think people realize it. And whether there's trafficking or not in an abusive relationship, it doesn't happen on day one.
Yeah.
You don't go on a first date with someone and they hit you and try and force you into porn. It happens after a long time of emotional abuse, verbal abuse, slowly breaking down your boundaries. I read something recently, and I can't remember the name of the book, but it was talking about how domestic abusers essentially use the same sort of tactics as cult leaders. It's essentially just a cult of one.
Yes.
And so you become very trauma bonded to that person, very emotionally dependent. Your self-worth is broken down. Your ability to even think that you have the strength to leave is broken down. You will start blaming yourself. I went through those typical patterns. So the first few times that he was physically violent towards me, he would then cry and be upset. And I would start thinking it was my fault. I'd pushed him. If only I hadn't said this or hadn't done this. And because he had quite a traumatic childhood, so I would feel sorry for him and it wasn't his fault. And so there's all that going on. Not only are you scared of them, but there's also a certain amount in the beginning of perhaps thinking that you can rescue them and almost feeling guilty. It's impossible to see when you're in it. So I can look back now and see the patterns. But when you're in it, you can't do that. You can't step outside and see what that person is doing because you're in it. And then by the time the forced webcamming happened, by this time I was completely terrified of him. He'd already sexually abused me himself. I'd already been raped and beaten quite badly by him. So by the time things like this happen, you're completely in that control. And the option to refuse it's not there. And this is quite a well-known statistic now. But again, I think people who are not very aware of the realities of domestic abuse probably don't know this. The most dangerous time for a woman in an abusive relationship is when she leaves.
Yes.
When your abuser says to you, I will kill you if you leave, this isn't just a threat. This happens. And actually, my perpetrator ended up being arrested and prosecuted in exactly that situation. I'd tried to leave and he'd beaten me so badly that neighbours called the police. And I was then taken to a refuge 50 miles across the country with my children. That is a very real threat. When women say I was too scared to leave and people almost hand wave that away as if it's an excuse, this is a reality.
A lot of women, in order to be believed, they have to turn up dead, essentially. What was that horrible American case about the woman whose relationship fight was like put on the internet and everyone said, oh, she's clearly unhinged, she's the abuser. And then now we only believe her because she turned up dead. That's how we know. It was Gabby Petito. That was the name.
There's been a case recently here, and again, I'm not sure of the lady's name, but she was killed, and they're saying in all the papers, why was nothing done? This guy had been reported to the police 6 times. And you're absolutely right. The attention is only paid after the fact, after these women are killed.
In everything you just shared, there's so much to pick up on. I'll start with one thing, and that's webcamming and just online porn, because there's this common misconception that, oh, you just need a camera and a female body. So this is lots of women and their independent business. And I always say to people, you have absolutely no idea what's happening when the camera gets turned off. I know that some traffickers and that they will also appear on cameras, and it's a couple. Is ethical porn because it's a couple doing things together in front of the camera. And I'm like, you have no idea if that's her trafficker. You have no way of knowing. And of course she'll be smiling when she's on camera. And I'm sure she'll say, this is all fine. That's how it works. But people are really sold on this idea that, okay, maybe prostitution is dubious, but porn, especially OnlyFans now, that's independent business women. Even though, how long have we all been hearing the details about the Andrew Tate case? Like, we know traffickers could be running 80% of those accounts. We got no way of verifying that.
The Andrew Tate thing isn't new. It's just that he's perhaps the first person who's been famous enough and perhaps silly enough to go on podcasts and just openly talk about it and try and make money out of teaching men his tactics. Like, he has that whole hustler university, but this isn't new. This is what these men have been doing for decades. I watched the documentary about him where the guys, I think the journalist went undercover and exposed some of the things that Andrew Tate is teaching men, and he is essentially teaching them how to control and then traffic their girlfriends. And there was so much that I recognised. This isn't new. This isn't something that he invented. This has been going on for a long time. When I was in the refuge, after leaving that part of the women's refuge, we did a group programme called the Freedom Programme, which goes along with a book called Living with a Dominator, which I believe you can buy online. And I think the programme was actually written by a woman who used to work with domestic abusers and sex offenders in like a rehabilitation programme, and then realised that those rehabilitation programmes weren't working. But what she did find out was just how many deliberate tactics are used. And so the Freedom Programme kind of goes through these different personas that abuser can adopt. And so one of them was the sex offender. And that's the first time I ever saw anyone mention the fact that trafficking and forced prostitution and forced pornography can occur in a domestically abusive relationship. It was the first time I'd seen any organisation or programme even mention the possibility. And I remember feeling not exactly relieved, because obviously it was an awful thing to go through, but just finally unbelieved, and not on my own, because people have obviously already been observing this. Because for a long time I felt there must be something wrong with me, because I haven't heard of this happening before. This has happened to me twice now. This must be an issue with me. And I think many victims, survivors feel like that. It's something that abusers will try and instill into you, of course, that it's your fault, you're the problem. But because I'd never seen it spoken about or acknowledged, it was that much harder to come to terms with it and to be able to open up. So to see it mentioned, however briefly, as part of a programme for survivors as domestic abuse, I was like, oh my gosh, it's not me, it's him. So that was a fantastic programme. I don't know how widespread that is among women's refuges. To anyone listening to this who works in that field, I hope they'd have a look at it, because I found it really helpful. And because it focuses as well on the perpetrator, even in some organisations that support women, programmes that they run can still be so much focused on the women or even the girl, as in what you need to look out for,
Yeah.
what behaviours you need to do or not be doing in order to avoid these men. Whereas this is what a perpetrator looks like, this is what he does.
Yeah.
That's needed, because we can't keep making the perpetrators almost invisible and keep putting the onus on the victims to avoid it.
And especially when it comes to emotional manipulation, it's like dangerous to say to a woman, there is a way that you can 100% avoid this and it won't happen to you. There's a way to become 100% perpetrator proof. I think that's when it's the most dangerous, if you think, oh, I couldn't be targeted, because it's just, like you said, it's gradual, it's mind bending, and emotional abuse easily turns into physical and sexual abuse. But emotional abuse is still something that we're only very slowly as a society even coming to grapple with. I think coercive control is one of those terms now showing up even in courts or legal discussions and in social work, to just understand how powerful that is. Like you mentioned, that with the guilt tripping. And it's this like quite perverse situation where a lot of victims, they might even be half the age of the perpetrator, but they have almost parental or motherly feelings towards that person. That's how really there's many different words for it. I know vulnerable narcissism is one of those. It's hotly debated whether the whole term narcissism is controversial, but I do find reading some of that material, I was like, oh my God, that mirrors traffickers' tactics and domestic violence tactics. But when you're talking to a person who is in that situation, they will often not be receptive, right? There's times when you can't reach people, just like you can't always reach people in cults. It's really horrific often that someone does need to hit a rock bottom before they can wake up.
We want to take a brief moment to thank you for your listenership. As an independent volunteer collective, our episodes are only made possible because of donations from people like you. Please visit our website, www.redlightexposé.com, and click the donate button. Your support is greatly appreciated. And now, back to the episode.
If you're comfortable sharing how you were able to break out of the mindset yourself and start seeking help.
It's messy. The reason I finally tried to leave, and as I say, that was at the point where he was the most violent. And I sort of want to give a trigger warning here. The whole episode is a trigger warning, I guess, but this is something I always personally find quite horrific. I'd become pregnant to my perpetrator, and after physically trying to induce a miscarriage, he then forced me to go and have an abortion. And after all of the horrific things I'd been through and he put me through, I think that was the thing that broke me. And you could do a whole other episode on this, but forced abortion is a real issue in sex trafficking as well.
Yes.
And one
Yes.
that I think even feminists tend to avoid because of the whole not wanting to be seen as anti-abortion. But the statistics for that are really high. And so that was the point at which I left. And then, as I say, I was attacked. And so I didn't get the authorities involved. They became involved. I've had a lot of run-ins with the police and services that have not been positive. But that time I was given a domestic abuse liaison officer and she was great. And they got me into a refuge, and the refuge was fantastic. As I say, they did the freedom program, but also it was largely women who were survivors themselves who were running the refuge. And although I was only there for a few months, and as much as I was obviously horrendously traumatized while I was there, it's not entirely a bad memory because of the support that I received.
Yeah.
And just being around other women who'd been through the same thing, there was a real sense of solidarity with one another. And I think it's just that sense of, oh my God, I'm not alone. Because you never meet. When you're in an abusive relationship, you might spot other people who are also in abusive relationships, but you're not exactly having the chance to get together and talk about it. You only meet other women who've survived it if you've got out and survived it yourself. So you don't get that recognition with other women until that point. And that was really powerful, just being in a group of other women and being able to discuss our experiences. But I didn't leave the sex industry immediately. So again, I ended up in a situation where I was teaching ESOL at this point. In the intervening years, I'd been to university and I'd got myself a job that I loved. But because I was moved to refuge, I had to leave that. My son had been left behind with his father. He just started secondary school and I didn't want to whip him halfway across the country. And my intention was, once the court case and everything was over, to hopefully go home. So I was in this really precarious position. And so I carried on actually under my own lights, webcamming for some time. I think the thing with the sex industry, particularly if you're coerced into it, is much like the abusive relationship, it breaks you down. And once you've done it, once you're in it, because of the stigma, because of the shame, because of the victim blaming, there's a sense that, well, what else can I do now? This is what I am now. And you become very desensitized to it. So by this point, webcamming was the least of all evils in terms of the sex industry. And so I carried on for a while trying to ferret some money away. And so, yeah, my process out was very messy.
But that too, from everything I've heard, is just so common.
Absolutely.
I know a lot of women who were trafficked even as children, and then they're 20-something and they've managed to escape the trafficker. But other means of making money, like, you don't easily necessarily reintegrate into the regular economy if you're having panic attacks or just proximity. Like, even just people say this in Germany all the time. No one needs to work at the brothel. They can just become a cashier because it'll take anybody. But if you have PTSD, if you have trauma, you're working as a cashier and there's stranger after stranger, including late at night, there's quite a lot of drunk men. And I can imagine that would be really triggering. Lots of male strangers, including rude or drunk customers. So even a low-level entry job, you don't just easily go back into that. People really think, oh, you can just leave the brothel tomorrow and do something else, and they don't understand all these different barriers. Many women will have a gap in their education. I also know a number who put themselves through university against the odds. Hats off to all the women who managed that. But I can imagine restarting is hard. And the other part of dissociation, if you're right deep in the throes of it, you might think, yeah, I think I'm okay. I think this is not hurting me. The effect can be delayed even by years sometimes, if you want to touch on.
And I think webcamming, if you've been trafficked, so as I was, literally sent to a sex buyer against your will, if you've been on a porn set against your will, or even chosen to be on a porn set and then things happen to you on the set against your will, which is incredibly common. I say this all the time to people. I think they don't seem to understand this, that once the camera's rolling, there is no. So if you've been through that, then webcamming, as I said, seems like the lesser of all evils. But actually, I wasn't able to continue it for very long because now that I was out of the relationship and I'd been through that program in the refuge and I was trying to piece my life back together, I was starting to process what happened. And I was having panic attacks at the thought of having to go and perform on webcam. It got to a point where I couldn't physically do it anymore.
What was just coming, as you were saying, coming to my mind is the sex work movement. They call it sex worker burnout. I'm currently having some mild carpal tunnel. I'm trying to get ahead of it and get treatment. And they would say, oh, Ellie, you work at the desk just like you have carpal tunnel from typing too much. Other people, they just get a bit burned out with webcam requests. It's the same thing. And they just need rest. And then you go back and just need to do some good food, yoga, just talk to some friends, maybe get into the right mindset, and then you can go back that narrative.
Yeah. And it's just ludicrous. Like, PTSD is not burnout. It's not the same thing as work stress. It's trauma. The word trauma can get thrown around a little bit too much, I think, which is perhaps why we've starting to equate these things. But in terms of terms like sex worker burnout, I can't help but think this is a deliberate attempt to obfuscate, because these are not the same. And anyone who's experienced PTSD for any reason will know that it is not the same as burnout. And the difference clearly is if you have PTSD, you're not ever going to be able to go back to the thing that traumatized you because you have PTSD. Whereas burnout, as you say, maybe you can go on holiday, take a break, do some yoga, and you might be able to resume your job. These aren't the same things. And it's almost gaslighting to say to women, regardless of whether they're in prostitution or pornography because of coercion or poverty or any other reason, if they're experiencing trauma and it's affecting them, to say, oh, this is just burnout, it's gaslighting, perpetuating this whole kind of just victim blaming nonsense, really. It's something that I really struggle with around the sex work rhetoric, this attempt to make it seem like any other work when it isn't. You can't
Yeah.
make having sex with people you don't want to have sex with a form of work. We have ordinarily, when there's not money involved, we have a name for having sex with people you don't want to have sex with, and it's called rape.
Yeah. I'm sure you've seen it too, even just on Twitter. I see accounts all the time who do use the language of sex work, but then go on to describe crimes and assaults and PTSD symptoms, like having to get drunk or high to endure the work. Like it's talked about, like nobody likes their job. I do know some people take substances to get through their work, but it's not standard and it's not something to normalize or glamorize or push through. And like you said, like the onus is on the individual then so if you can't do it sober, well, that's your problem.
Where trafficking and domestic violence is concerned, there is often an intersection with addiction as well. And that was also part of my story, is I ended up with a class A drug addiction that I then also had to get over as part of my process of getting out of the relationship and getting out of pornography. And in my case, I first started taking them because I was given them by my trafficker. The person that I was in an abusive relationship with started to give me substances as a way to get me to do the things that you need me to do. So it was cocaine, and it does help you to numb out, in my experience. So I ended up addicted to that. And this, again, is something I hear is quite a common story. It's quite often women are introduced to drugs by their trafficker, or and the other way around, because I was involved in addiction recovery circles for quite a long time after my exit and did a lot of work in the recovery field as well. And you hear this a lot where women, perhaps they're in a drug using relationship with a man. So commonly heroin or crack cocaine. It can be any substance really. And then the guy will start trafficking them to get the drug money. So it can happen either way around. Either the abuser is already intending on trafficking you and drugs are a way to break you down and keep you pliable, or they're trafficking you to get money for the drug addiction. But there is an intersection. It's something I'm sometimes wary to talk about in certain channels, because there is the stereotype of the drug-addled prostitute, and the right wing will take that and run with it and use it as a way to, again, victim blame. And so it can be really difficult to talk about these things, but I don't think we can let the right wing stop us from talking about things that are true and things that are real, because otherwise we won't get the support and women won't know that, again, that they're not on their own. I think drugs are a common tactic of traffickers.
This is referencing something you said a while back, but this is both in regards to drugs and in regards to abortion. We cannot be black and white about it. Just briefly referencing back to abortion, in Germany, we have a huge debate around this because our abortion laws are quite strict, actually. People think it's legal, but it's very limited. And technically, it's a crime only under very specific circumstances within a time frame. And you have to get like literal permission from other people. Are you allowed to access it? And then you are free from prosecution. But technically, it's still a crime. And the right wing would like to limit it. And that's a real threat as everything's moving to the right. But the more that I learned about domestic violence and trafficking and about forced abortion, I was like, this idea of the average woman has all options open to her. She can have the child. She cannot have the child. She's financially okay. She has all the education she would need to fully think through her options. That's just not true for every woman. And so we have to have a system that takes vulnerability into account. And I do think there has to be a legal mandated, open-ended conversation with a social worker / health professional to say, what is your situation? What do you need? And by the way, if anyone is forcing you either way to have it or not have it, that's a crime. And here are your options if you need help. And I get pushback from feminists on this, who are like, no, we cannot limit the choice because that'll then be used against all women. And like, we have to have some kind of balance. And then on the drug issue, also super complicated. Of course, what we really need is a society where people don't feel like they need drugs because we're healthy and connected. So our use is recreational at best. Yeah, it's so frustrating how the law comes down on the most vulnerable, right? Most addicted people are quite vulnerable. But what's not illegal is drug prostitution in Germany. It's not a crime. We have what we call Drogenstrich, like a drug street prostitution. And it's not illegal for a man to buy access to a woman who's in the throes of addiction. This Yeah, so that's fine. What he's doing is fine. It's always on her. So the woman seeking addiction treatment or the woman seeking an abortion, it's all about her. And we're still so bad at looking at all the men orbiting around her, profiting off of her financially, sexually, etc. We have so much work to do just because it can be complicated and delicate. We can't shy away from these issues because otherwise we're going to fail women who really need us.
I feel like that's what's happening. I think because the public conversations around this stuff are so polarized, and it seems like there's a real feeling on the left to really avoid some topics and not talk about them because of pushback or because of co-option by the right, that then the most vulnerable who are experiencing these things and at risk of these things just aren't being heard and aren't being protected. But if we don't talk about things, if we don't talk about these more difficult topics, we let the right have them, and then they are the only people talking about them, and it shouldn't be that way. I was absolutely screamed at by feminists online for trying to raise the forced abortion issue, which was quite upsetting because, as I say, this isn't anything that's unique to me. This is a real problem within both domestic violence and sex trafficking, and the stats are there. So it's something that you'd think as feminists we need to be speaking about, but there's so much worry about the anti-abortion rhetoric that they won't touch it. But we need to be able to talk about it. There's a difference between safeguarding and gatekeeping. They're two different things.
And it's the same with sex. We want to be free to have consensual sex with consenting partners and not be shamed, but we also need protection from violence. We have to do this balance on almost all women's issues. The subject of children and domestic violence situations, we don't want to threaten women with taking away their children because then they won't speak up. But there might sometimes be situations where we do have to do that intervention. It should be done very carefully and be the exception, but sometimes it might be the best option for the child. And that's super, super delicate. I barely know how to start having that conversation, but we have to. There's no way around it.
I don't know what the situation would be in Germany, but certainly here, there's a real distrust of social services. And although I've never really had much involvement with them myself, I've seen it with women that I know. And when I was in the refuge, how social workers will treat women escaping domestic violence. Again, the victim blaming is horrendous. There's a lot of stories coming out at the minute around family courts. Ex-abusers are essentially still abusing women through the family court around access to the children and things like that. And a woman who says, I don't want my children to see him because he's abusive. It's then, well, you have to let him see them, otherwise we'll take them away from you because you're not upholding your end of the custody agreement. And it's horrendous. The way abusers will use children to just continue abusing.
In Germany, actually, as far as I know statistically, if a woman accuses a man of domestic violence, she's more likely to lose custody.
Wow.
So it increases the DARVO that they pull, the reversal of victim offender, and she's trying to use the children against me. There's a whole lobby. They call themselves the father lobby or the dad lobby, who say the most underestimated emotional abuse of men is women cutting off contact to children. And they've been quite successful. A lot of courts really think that this is something that women do just to punish men en masse, like a mass phenomenon of women just being like, oh, he has someone new. How can I get back at him? Okay, he's not seeing the children anymore. Rather than that being a last resort. And also just the idea that there are courts that think a man, he could be dangerous to his ex-wife, but he's safe for the children.
Yeah, which is crazy.
Yes, this happens all the time. I said at some point in this episode, we're making progress on domestic violence, but it's one step forward, three steps back.
Absolutely. And it's another reason when people say, why doesn't she just leave? There's another reason. No mother's going to risk losing her children. The amount of women I've spoken to who will say that they've had it in their head, I'll just hang on until the children are old enough that he can't take them from me and then I can leave. And again, it's a real reality. It's not something we make up in our heads. This is really happening. You've got the worry that they're going to kill you, the worry that they're going to take your children, where there's trafficking involved as well. And this was certainly something that was held over my head. So something my abuser would say to me is, if you leave, I'll send these videos to your family. I'll put this all over Facebook. Everybody will know. And again, with the children issue, I've seen social services be very stigmatizing and judgmental towards women who have had any involvement with prostitution and pornography, even where that's been because of an abuser that will go against the woman rather than the man. Society almost makes it next to impossible to leave, and then we blame women for not leaving.
And we have a million slurs for a sexually exploited woman. Do we have a single slur for a man who sexually exploits either as a buyer or a pimp? Not even pimp is really a slur, because I think it can be used colloquially to actually someone cool. We have a few episodes on our show about the subject of language. We have the term rapist, and it is a bad word, but do we have actual slurs for sexually, physically, emotionally violent men?
No, there isn't anything specific that I can think of. Other than your sort of usual insults that you'd throw at anyone. There's nothing specific. I tend to use the word punter for sex buyer, and I certainly mean it in a derogatory way, but I suppose that is quite a neutral word. It's not necessarily used as an insult. So no, I don't think there's anything really. And as you say, pimp, which should be an insult and certainly can be used, but it's also, you have MTV programs like Pimp My Ride.
And I've heard from women who were in relationships, it can be a trafficker. It can also be this sort of gray zone where it's living off the avails, but there is some pressure to keep bringing in the money. So men who are living off of prostitution money, and are they directing it? It's a little bit of a gray area. Not all of them will physically push her, but they can be in a bad mood if there's no money this week. So there's different ways to pressure someone, not all of which would be legally liable, but maybe some of them should be. It's delicate because we don't also want to per se criminalize a prostituted woman's partner. But what I've heard is, be that a pimp or someone living off the avails or someone in between, when there's a fight in the relationship, if we want to call that, he will then insult her for being in the industry, and he'll call her, even though he's facilitating and profit, he wants the money and whatever else, the control that he can get out of it, but she's still dirty to him, which if you think about the abuser's mentality, it makes sense, but it's just a extreme double standard, and our whole society affirms it. We literally can't slur him. We don't have one slur for him.
It's incredibly crazy making, and my abuser would do that to me. And when I would throw back at him, you made me do this. And it would be, well, because I knew that you'd be good at it. I knew that you deep down you love it and all this. And because in the beginning of our relationship, he really loved bombed me. No, it wasn't. I can honestly say that in the first 6 months, I didn't see any red flags, even looking back. And maybe to someone else who hadn't already been through my experiences, there would have been, but I was oblivious for the first few months. And because I'd confided in him, one of the few people in my life that I'd confided in about my first trafficking experience, he could then use that against me always. Oh, you were already a prostitute anyway. Why would anyone else want you anyway?
Wow.
And what's your problem with doing this? You did that.
Yes. Yes.
It just becomes a trap. You can never win with an abuser. And I think what you just said about being manipulated to make more money, when you're in an abusive relationship, whether there's trafficking involved or not, I think you become, purely for the sake of survival, so attuned to their moods.
Yes.
And their wants. And so you will almost fall over yourself to keep them happy so that they don't explode, so that you don't get hit. And that can look like you're capitulating in your own abuse, but it's a natural survival mechanism. I've heard trauma experts talk about this, that as well as flight, freeze, and fight, you have fawn, where you will try and appease your abuser. And if you're stuck with them for a length of time and you've got no means of escape, of course it makes sense. Of course you're going to try and keep them happy to keep yourself safe. But for the woman who's in that, it can feel like you're going along with them. You start shaming yourself almost.
There's another topic that we talked about in our pre-conversation for this, which connects to it all, which is that reporting an abuser, not only does social work often fail and the justice system, but your own community can be against you. There's mistrust in social services, mistrust in the police for good reason, because it can be, well, imperfect anyway, but harmful. And when I hear about people being arrested for not paying their TV licenses en masse in the UK, I'm like, what is the system? It's insane. So not to say to those communities that mistrust in police is misplaced or unreasonable. It's not. But what do you do as a woman if you're part of a marginalized community because you're poor, you're racial minority, or whatever other factor there is, and then the abuser is marginalized in some way, or you are politically very left-wing, and then there's like all cops are bastards, right? ACAB. I've heard that from stable middle-class people are like, no, you can never call the cops, even if you're stalked. No, you have to sit down and have it out. I really struggle with that because I hear about the police abuse I know women whose pimps and traffickers were cops. This is a serious issue that we have to pay attention to, and I don't even know how we're going to untangle it. But what's a woman going to do? She's supposed to call up her burly brother to fight it out for her. Do you want to be medieval about this? Like, seriously, what are her options? What is she supposed to do? And you said you were in that situation where your community was averse to getting anyone outside involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And that sort of rhetoric from the left drives me absolutely insane. I've really seen that creeping in over the past few years. But for me, so my first trafficker was an ethnic minority man. And then my boyfriend abuser was he was from the same ethnic minority of me. So I'm of Roma traveller heritage. And so was he. And from a very sort of working class council estate background. And in that community, you don't call the police for anything. To be a snitch or a grass is like the worst possible thing you can be. And there's also, and I think this is getting better as we go down generations, but certainly for many people in my generation, certainly for my parents' generation, you don't call the police about domestic abuse. This is just something that happens. It's almost expected. And it's almost there's something wrong with you as a woman if you can't handle a bit of domestic abuse. So there's this whole kind of cultural narrative around these things. And sex trafficking, sexual abuse in general, is something that just doesn't get spoken about. There's so much victim blaming. I obviously have to be careful what I say here for legal and safety reasons. So when my perpetrator was arrested for what he'd done to me, I actually never ended up going to court for what he'd done to me, partly because I was just terrified and I didn't want to come back to my hometown and be anywhere around him and his sort of associates. Also because the police officer who was dealing with it had said, we can probably get him on assault, but the sexual abuse, the trafficking, this is going to be really hard to prove. I just didn't want to go through it. It affected my daughter more than my son, but I managed to somehow keep the worst of everything that was happening away from my kids. And I didn't see how I was going to go through an entire court case. You potentially even got the media involved and keep them away from that. So that was another reason to not do it. But what I was able to do was lead the police towards other things that he could be arrested for because he was a person of interest. And that went against all of my sort of upbringing, all of the cultural narratives that had been installed in me. It's an incredibly difficult thing to do. I was very much a pariah among certain members of my community because I'd had this guy arrested. Even though some people knew what he was and what he was like, but you still don't go to the police. Years later, when I started becoming involved in sort of feminist movements and speaking out about all this, it is nearly always liberal, middle-class, white people talking about how we should never report ethnic minority or working class perpetrators to the police because it's racist and it's perpetuating capitalism and the patriarchy. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Yes, our carceral system is horrendous. Yes, it's racist. Yes, it's classist. I know all these things. Men from Roman traveller communities are massively overrepresented, not fairly, within our criminal justice system. But you cannot say to a woman whose lives and the lives of her children are literally at risk not to go to the only avenue of support or safety she may have. You know, it's hard enough for victims to go to the police anyway because the police quite often are terrible, aren't supportive, do victim blame. So we can't make that situation worse by then shaming women who do go. It cannot be racist to report an abuser because they're from an ethnic minority, for example. Quite often, statistically, their victim will also be from an ethnic minority. So then how are you not being racist towards her? But also, isn't there a kind of weird racism in saying that if you're from one of these marginalized groups, whether it's ethnically or class or disability or whatever, you can't be held accountable? Are we not infantilizing people then and saying, oh, you're not responsible for your actions because you belong to this marginalized group? It just doesn't make sense to me.
You know, it might make sense. Someone who's very poor and they steal, maybe even rob, I can see that, or they deal drugs. When it comes to domestic violence, sexual violence, although, I mean, there is a money aspect to that, I don't accept that excuse. And I think it is a misunderstanding of how crime happens and not understanding, yes, there are crimes of desperation, I'm sure, but hitting or raping one's partner is about power. It's not desperation. And yes, I'm sure it's about bruised ego of the man who is the underdog in society. And he doesn't have power over all those other men, but he's got power over some of the women and maybe also some of the men in his life. It's like this rosy picture of the just united working class where everyone is on the same team.
It's never been true. And I think it's especially never been true for women.
Yeah, it's something that I'm not in a lot of leftist spaces. I tend to just be in feminist spaces. But when I hear from some of the women who go into these big sex spaces, discussions of sexism, sexist violence is the first thing to go out the window and to be taboo. And so the supposed resistance movement just has a massive blind spot. I know that feminism has its own blind spots, like not looking at class and race as much, but any mixed sex movement, just women's needs go out the window really quickly. And the other thing that I was thinking of as we're talking, it's right that left-wing view of the world, as in we can see the governments and the organizations and the institutions being oppressive, but then we struggle with the individual male abuser. And that's how you end up, as we talked about, with the concept of torture, where we have this concept that a government can torture a political prisoner or an army can do that to a prisoner of war, but that men are doing it to their partners in their private homes is something that's also only very slowly being recognized. And there should be an episode going out before this one, an entire episode dedicated to the subject and the women who brought the concept to the public of non-state torture, which means domestic violence, prostitution, trafficking. If you want to say something about that, I know we mentioned it in our pre-chat, it's many individual men and together they form a system, but it doesn't look the same as this government oppression or police oppression. And so the left really struggles with it.
I think it's a really important topic. And when you told me about that and I looked at the questionnaires and they were triggering, so it's important to warn survivors who are planning on taking them. I did find it really upsetting. But there is a type of power in being able to name your experiences. I wasn't fully able to understand what had happened to me until I understood that it was trafficking.
Mm-hmm.
And in the same way, I had a kind of a realization when I did these questionnaires that yes, a lot of what was done to me, particularly by that boyfriend abuser, was torture. If this was done by someone in the military, for example, or in a prison, this would be considered torture. And it was a shock because I don't think I would really have used that word before. But I think it's important because society seems to minimize domestic abuse. And as I said, we only seem to think about trafficking in terms of the kind of Liam Neeson international borders portrayal, which happens, of course. Obviously, international trafficking happens as well. We tend to think of it as this very obvious thing, a very specific thing, when actually the reality is a lot messier and a lot more common. When you use words like torture, it doesn't really allow you to minimize it, I don't think.
Yes. I feel like it's one of the few words we haven't said so much that it's empty yet. Trauma, we've overused. Abuse, now if you disagree with someone online, it can be cast as abuse. You cannot call the cops for so many violence against women situations, but apparently over tweets, you can call cops on people. I'm hearing some stuff out of the UK, which is bizarre. I don't understand the priorities. But what was I going to say? Yeah, torture is one of those terms that we haven't devalued yet. It still has an impact, and people, as far as I know, have at least close enough an idea of what it means. They understand it can be near death, extremely painful, and the impact can last a lifetime. It does get more complicated. I was about to say they understand that you can't consent to torture, but then I'm thinking about, as we've been starting to discuss in the pod, the subject of BDSM, how it gets recast as kink, fetish, play. That's one of those strange words they use, play. But it's actually acts that would be in that questionnaire. But there's still a window of opportunity for us to stop the normalization of that. I think that fight isn't fully won. Like, we can still do something to push back. But we are seeing these court cases where men say, oh yeah, she consented to strangulation. It was an accident. This was not domestic violence. This was fetish. Even on that front, we have work to do, but I still have some hope that a word like torture will be impactful. And that's also just the accurate description for what happens.
Absolutely. And it's really bizarre to me how the minute something becomes about a man's sexual desires, it becomes okay. Maybe this has changed, but I'm pretty sure that under UK law, you can't consent to torture. But when it's sex between a man and a woman, he's allowed to say, oh no, she consented. And you have the rough sex defense. You have torture porn as a category. This is not in any way illegal. I didn't experience this. I've had women tell me that they were waterboarded. This comes literally from state torture, right? And that they're doing it on porn sets.
I think some of this is technically illegal, especially in the UK. I think there's quite strong laws, but as we discussed, the victim needs to come forward. They need to have enough support to just emotionally be able to handle retelling that a million times to all the different institutional places that you need to take that through before it even lands before some judge. And so it's like illegal on paper and still very hard to prosecute in practice. It starts with a public understanding that this is how deep it goes. I would like to ask you about your writing, but is there something related to everything else we've talked about that we've missed that you feel we should mention before we jump to that other part?
Just to quickly go back to where we started when you were talking about the domestic sex trafficking and how the only thing that tends to get spoken about in the media is when it's minors.
Yeah.
I guess I just wanted to quickly make the point that they're treated in the media and sometimes in law as completely separate phenomenon, but they're not. Those minors who were trafficked then quite often go on to mainstream prostitution or pornography. They're often still coerced, possibly by the same traffickers. Or as you say, sometimes they just stay in it because they don't have any recourse to get out of it by that point. And also the traffickers are sometimes the same people. The idea that these men that are trafficking minors aren't also doing other things. They're quite often domestically abusive for a start. My first trafficker was obviously part of a kind of a ring. And I remember one of the drivers, and this is a memory that absolutely haunts me, although it wasn't anything at the time. So his quote unquote girlfriend, who I remember was quite heavily pregnant, was also one of the women being trafficked. And I remember thinking that she looked young, that she couldn't have been more than 16 or 17. Like I say, I was 19, 20, and I was probably one of the oldest girls that I saw, but we were never allowed to speak to each other. So if we were ever in the driver's car at the same time, we was forbidden to communicate. So I was never able to ask her, but he would always introduce her as his girlfriend, even though she was also being driven around to buyers. But then years later, Coventry had a grooming gang scandal. And when I saw the faces of the men in the paper, that driver was one of them. And so that's always haunted me ever since, because I can't help thinking about that girl because of how young she was, potentially one of the minors. I think people tend to separate these things, and they're not always separate, in the same way that you can't easily separate prostitution and trafficking, because even women who enter the sex trade out of choice, although I wouldn't say that poverty is ever much of a choice, but however they get there, you're then vulnerable to trafficking once you're in it because of the amount of users that are around.
Yeah.
And there's so much trafficking that goes on in the mainstream porn industry. I ended up doing films for like Red Hot TV, which is like a mainstream softcore kind of thing. There's so much overlap and trafficking and criminal networks and stuff. But with the trafficking of minors as well, there's a direct bleed-in to being prostituted once you're of age. It doesn't just go away. The girl doesn't reach 18 and the trafficker goes, oh, you can go now, particularly if they're in some kind of relationship. A lot of those girls had children to their abusers. So the abuse just continues in various ways.
Yeah, this is such a common misconception. There's a political push behind this. People say there's trafficking and there's sex work. And sex work, that can be tough days, but it's, again, no worse than me with a carpal tunnel. It's about the same. And trafficking is bad and it's happening somewhere over there. And it does not use, we know it does use the same websites and the same infrastructure and the same lingo and the same advertising strategies and the same men. So if I'm a man going to a brothel or I'm watching porn or whatever part I'm using, OnlyFans, whatever, I can never know for sure, is this an adult? Is this someone who's financially and emotionally all right? Is this someone who doesn't have someone in the background? I can literally never know. And what we're saying to men is essentially what the German government is communicating to them. It was for the longest time. A few years ago, we did start criminalizing knowingly paying to access a trafficked person. It's just an unenforceable law, because how are you going to prove that? I'm not aware of any prosecutions. But before that, it was just like, don't worry about it. The government is going to clean it up for you. We'll just do the occasional raid. How do you raid OnlyFans? But anyway, on the brothels, we'll do an occasional raid and just clean out the trafficking for you. And then the trafficking is a nuisance to the buyer, who would much prefer to think that the university student is doing this because it's her kinky hobby. And awareness that some of it often is trafficking, it's bothersome to him, but he's not responsible. He's just a customer. I always say, if someone goes to a nail salon, there's quite a lot of human trafficking into nail salons, which is true. But if I would get my nails done, for me to be able to tell if the woman is doing that because she's forced or not is quite hard. But we're talking about men, certainly in in-person prostitution, getting really up close to someone, as intimate as you can be. And if you're then not sure if that person wants to be there, well, you shouldn't be there. I think it's very simple. If you can't be sure if there's consent, you stay away. You keep your hands off and your money in your wallet.
I don't think they care, quite honestly. If you're prepared to have sex with someone who's only having sex with you because you're paying them, you clearly don't care really much about them or what they want. You're treating them as an object anyway.
And I've spent quite a lot of time on the John forums, so I know some of them have really detailed knowledge. They're like, that brothel is being supplied by Albanians, and that brothel, it's the Turkish Hells Angels, and that brothel, it's this guy. And so sometimes they're on first name basis. I don't know if you had that experience, if any man who was around at that time exploiting, if they ever had any idea or like even just asked, are you all right? Does that ever happen?
Not that I can remember. No one ever sat me down and was like, are you okay? Do you want to be doing this? Because they don't want their bubble burst. I'm sure you've heard of the girlfriend experience.
Yes.
And this was one of the things I was told to do, was to talk to them and be nice. And I remember with one guy, I'd just come from a buyer who was quite violent, so I was quite distressed. And I was really struggling to act as if I wasn't. And I remember the buyer being quite annoyed with me and saying, "You're supposed to be listening to me." Just quite like irritated that I was clearly having some kind of terrible time and that this was ruining his fantasy. I wrote an article with this as the title, actually. This has always stuck with me. I remember some guy saying to me now, and I can never remember the exact context he said it in, but he literally said the words, "I'm paying you not to say no."
Wow.
I think the sex work crowd talk about a lot, isn't it? Oh, it's not the consent that's for sale. As if you sit down with a sex buyer and go through like a questionnaire of the things you will or won't do and work out a contract beforehand. That doesn't happen. There is the expectation that you will do whatever they want. And of course, once you're either on a porn set or in a hotel room or in someone's place with them, what you're able to stop them doing is incredibly limited anyway. And they will always push boundaries, always.
And then the sex work advice kits are like, just make a joke. Because you can't just say, don't do this. You have to always protect his ego, because that's the most dangerous thing, hurting his ego. That's what ties it all together. You just can't relate to women as full human beings. And your position in society is contingent on proving some kind of bizarre idea of manhood. And one way to do it is to control women, is to buy women. And if that position is ever questioned, you're allowed to punish.
But it's interesting what you just said about that safety tip of pandering to the ego. That is no different. It's the exact same dynamic of what we were just talking about when I was saying when you're in an abusive relationship, you will fawn and try and pander to your abuser. So they are teaching predominantly women to do that. Oh, this is incredibly dangerous.
And so the way that you manage the domestic abuser is also the way that you manage the punter, right?
Yeah,
It's the same thing.
Yeah, it's exactly the same. I would go as far as to say, and obviously it's quite ironically, I don't want anyone to take this out of context, that being in an abusive relationship is almost like a training ground for being in prostitution, because it's the exact same survival tactics.
I think Andrea Dworkin, her quote is, "Incest is boot camp for prostitution," but you can insert any kind of familial or interpersonal violence. That makes depressing perfect sense. Yeah. I'd like to go into your writing career. First of all, I want to ask, what are the different things that you've written? Because if I'm not mistaken, some of it is crime stories, but you've also written romances. So there's like a palette of things you've written. I'm just curious, how did you get into writing? And is there like an evolution there of what you're writing about and for what audience?
It's connected, actually. So when I stopped webcamming, and like I say, I had to because I just wasn't able to physically do it, I started writing erotic stories and selling them on similar sites. And I always wanted to be a writer. That was obviously not what I wanted to write. But from a little kid, I've always made up stories and written down stories, and writing was an escape for me. I always would keep journals and things. And so when they picked up the little erotic stories, I started writing a column for a sort of like an online cosmopolitan type magazine. And then I got myself an agent and I got picked up a book contract writing sort of spicy romance stories. And so I was able to sort of transition into making a living doing something. But it's ironic because I'm writing these romance stories when I had zero clue what a healthy relationship looked like. I wouldn't write them the same way now. I was writing for Mills and Boon, historical like bodice rippers. And then I wrote a couple of crime novels which did really well. They're probably the books I'm proudest of because I put much more of me into them. And the second one, Eyes Wide Open, concerns a trafficking ring and all that. It's heavily fictionalized, so it isn't my story, but I did definitely put some of my experiences and some of my feelings into that book. So I wrote it in 2014 when I'd been out of all of this for 2 years. So it was all still very fresh and very raw. So that book was a real sort of labor of love. I've never been able to read it back through either. Then I met my husband and had my third child. And so stopped writing for a little while, obviously, because I was doing all that. And I also trained as a counsellor, and I was working with women in street prostitution and in addiction recovery. One of the things I did was teach expressive writing workshops. And when I went back to work after having my son, my agent got me some ghostwriting work. And then I've been doing that ever since, partly because I don't like doing all of the social media author interview stuff. So ghostwriting allows me to just write without having to do all that. And also, if I'm honest, until I spoke out about my experiences, which was 2019, I was always terrified of being recognised. I did a sort of local BBC news when one of my books, when I wasn't watching, did really well. And someone actually recognised me and wrote on the news site, "Oh, I've seen her on this site, this porn site," and I was mortified. So I was always scared of being, quote unquote, found out, especially because my two oldest were sort of teenagers then. And I can't imagine a worse time for come out about your mum than your teenagers. They're adults now and both doing really well, bless them. Ghostwriting worked for me really well, and I still mostly did a lot of romance, but also memoir, which is really interesting. And I've worked with a couple of sexual exploitation survivors on their memoir. Obviously, you have to be careful because it's ghostwriting, so I need to make sure you can't identify anything. But I also helped a woman do her memoir of escaping Islamic slavery / sex trafficking in another country, which was harrowing, but obviously really interesting. And that's work that I really enjoy. But at the minute, I'm not really working at all. I have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and currently can't really use my right arm for anything. I'm about to start having physio, maybe surgery. So I'm probably looking at having at least a year off while I try and get a better management program around my health, because I'm fast approaching the point where if I don't stop and have a break, I'm not going to be able to do anything. That's probably the only area in which my story is perhaps not the norm, is I was able to transition out of the sex trade and into a writing career, which people seem to assume that you're going to be absolutely rolling in money if you're a published writer, which isn't true. Even if you do well, unless you're J.K. Rowling, that's not happening. But I was able to keep me and my children going. But I always like to stress to people, although I feel incredibly blessed and I'm glad I was able to do that isn't going to be the norm for most survivors. Generally, it's really hard to financially get out and to transition. I think if I wasn't lucky enough to have been picked up by publications and by an agent, I would never have been able to carry on in the sex industry, as I said. But I wonder what situation I'd have been in, because I was terrified. Like you said, trying to go back to normal work, 9 to 5 with PTSD is incredibly difficult. And I'd become so socially awkward because even though I knew this wasn't true, I felt like everyone knew and everyone was looking at me and talking about it. So I can't imagine being able to go to a job interview. I was incredibly lucky in that respect. And for a lot of survivors, it's not going to be that way. I do think, though, that being able to express ourselves creatively, not necessarily as a job, but just in terms of creative expression, whether that's writing or music or dance or baking or whatever it is, can be really healing. One of the best things I've done since getting out, and I wasn't paid for this, but is hands down the teaching creative and expressive writing to female survivors. I did that for quite a few years in my local community for various organisations. Of course, when you're in it and you've just gotten out of certain situations, you need other things before you need that. You need food and housing and clothing before you need a creative writing class. I'm not doubting that. But seeing the way women would light up when they were finally able to express something or put something down on paper or realize that they could express themselves or they could be creative, the sort of the self-esteem boost that comes from that was work that I really enjoyed. I really loved. And I wish we got more funding for those things. But of course, we need funding for the basic resources first, and we're not even always getting that. So
Yes, absolutely. I would actually recommend to listeners, we do have another episode called Processing Prostitution Through Poetry with Chaucer Cameron, who's a UK-based poet.
Oh, I didn't see that one.
Oh yeah, I highly recommend it. It's an underrated episode because I know it's Processing Prostitution Through Poetry. It seems like an odd title, like what does that mean? But I really recommend it. And she goes into a lot of detail of her writing process, and her experiences of exploitation are decades ago, but they're still with her. So it's partially fictionalized and partially autobiographical. And her partner is a filmmaker, and they actually made a poetry film together and traveled back to some of the locations even where the exploitation took place. It's really moving and really an underestimated avenue of healing. She does say it's not like it's some kind of magical self-therapy. And there can be times where you trigger yourself quite badly. And it can be hard to know, when am I ready and what is the right form for me? And do you have any advice on that front?
Just go easy on yourself. I think that's where groups can help rather than trying to process it by yourself. It is easy to trigger yourself. I have a spoken word piece I've been working on for a few years now around my experiences. And I know it's good work. I think it's probably some of the best work I've done, but A, I can't finish it, and B, I don't think I'd ever be able to bring myself to perform it because I find it triggering.
Yeah.
So even when you've been doing this stuff for a while, it can still be difficult. So I think if you're starting off, then probably finding a supportive group, if there's one around, survivors group specifically, can help. It's something I've been looking at while I'm off work, is whether I could potentially start something like that up, actually, like some kind of charity or non-profit around expressing sexual trauma through writing, because I think it is something we could do with having more of, really.
Are there any places you'd like listeners to find you if they want a link Eyes Wide Open? But is there anything, do you have a website or a social media profile?
Only my ghostwriting profile, but I don't know if I necessarily want to link to that.
I'll just link Eyes Wide Open. Thank you so much for being on and sharing everything you shared.
Thank you, Ellie.
And thank you to the listeners for staying with us. We hope you tune in again next time.
We hope you found this episode informative. To follow us on social media, click the links in the show notes below.
If there is a topic you would like us to cover, you can contact us at redlightexposé.podcast@gmail.com or head on over to our website, redlightexposé.com. There you can also find a donation page if you'd like to support the show. All the hosts at Red Light Exposé are volunteers, so we rely on your donations to continue to compensate our survivor guests and cover operative costs. Thank you for listening. We hope you tune in next time.